Hello, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful event launching Chris Harker's new book, Spacing Debt, Obligations, Violence and Endurance in Ramallah, Palestine. We're very lucky this evening to be joined by three wonderful academics who've given their time to respond to Chris's writing and his provocations around debt in Palestine. Professor Rema Hammami, Professor Deborah James, and Professor Kareem Rabie. I'm going to begin by, first of all, just letting you know that we hope that you will ask questions and that you will discuss and be provoked by Chris's work. So if you'd like to ask a question at the end of the presentations, please do use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I will try and spot the hands. So I want to begin, first of all, by talking a little bit about the panelists this evening, and perhaps I could begin with Chris himself. So Chris's current research examines spatial practices of debt and finance in Palestine and the UK. He's interested in everyday practices of politics and agency, and in developing alternatives that allow people to both manage existing debt problems and create new forms of flourishing beyond debt. This means asking far-reaching questions about how real quality of life can be financed, how we can pay for the societies we want, and how we can create more inclusive forms of value. What options are available for the majority of people whose efforts to create meaningful lives are not supported by existing financial systems and relations? How do we move from failing forms of finance and growth economics that create inequality and ecosystem destruction towards more inclusive and sustainable forms of prosperity? And his published work advances a spatial conceptualization of debt, as I've said. He draws on a decade-long ethnographic engagement with the Palestinian city of Ramallah to analyze the role debt plays amidst a broader range of sociocultural and economic practices to create new modes of living in the face of ongoing colonial occupation. His extensive ethnographic fieldwork offers a rich understanding of the varied debt relations within and beyond Ramallah and forms of agency he characterizes as endurance. And he explores these ideas most extensively in this wonderful new book, Spacing Debt. Now, our other panelists this evening, Professor Kareem Rabie is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the American University in Washington, DC. He studies privatization, urban development, and the state building project in the West Bank. While on research leave in 2021, Professor Rabie will be a visiting fellow at CUNY's Center for Place, Culture and Politics and the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. And previously, he was Harper Smith Fellow at the University of Chicago and Marie Curie Fellow and Senior Researcher at the Center on Migration, Policy and Society at the University of Oxford. And his first book, Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited, is forthcoming in April. Great title, isn't it? From Duke University Press. And his current research focuses on the new human geographies of Palestine and China trade. Professor Deborah James is Professor of Anthropology at the London School of Economics. Her research sits within South Africa's apartheid system and its aftermath. It's documented and started by documenting in her work the lives of the country's Black migrant population as they weathered the many storms of that regime. And then after that, the effects on people of attempts to eradicate forms of injustice left over following its demise. She's also done research on advice, especially debt advice, in the context of the UK government's austerity programme. And here her work demonstrates the often counterintuitive ways in which financialized capitalism, even as some of its logics and agents plunge people further into debt, also provides funds to ensure that welfare arrangements are not erased completely. Following on from her book, Gaining Ground, Rights and Property in South African Land Reform, which explored the complexities of the post-apartheid government's land reform program. Her next work, Money from Nothing, Indebtedness and Aspiration in South Africa, explores the contradictory dynamics surrounding South Africa's national project of financial inclusion which aimed to extend credit to Black South Africans as a critical aspect of broad-based economic enfranchisement. The book captures brilliantly the lived experience of debt for those many millions who attempt to improve their position or merely sustain their existing livelihoods in emerging economies. And Remy Hammami is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Birzeit University, where she's been a faculty member in the Institute of Women's Studies since 1995. She received her BA in Political Science from the University of Cincinnati and her MA and PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Temple University. Her publications cover a wide array of issues as they relate to the Palestine context, including gender, nationalism, and armed conflict, NGOs, politics, and civil society, and everyday geographies of spatial control and resistance. Recent publications include Who Answers to Gazan Women, a study in economics, rights, and security, and Kalandira, Jerusalem's Torah Bora and the Frontiers of Global Inequality. Professor Hammami is a contributing editor to Middle East Reports, Development and Change, Feminist Review, and the Arab Studies Journal. And she was appointed as the Prince Claus Chair in Development and Equity for 2005 to 2006 at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. And welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming this evening. And we're delighted to have you at the IGP. Now, let me say a little bit about the book itself and a few words perhaps to frame things. Now, in Spacing Debt, Chris Harker demonstrates that financial debt is as much a spatial phenomenon as it is a temporal and social one. He traces the emergence of debt in Ramallah after 2008 as part of the financialization of the Palestinian economy under Israeli settler colonialism. As his work shows, debt contributes to processes through which Palestinians are kept economically unstable and subordinate. The book draws extensively on residents' accounts of living with the explosion of personal debt to highlight the entanglement of consumer credit with other obligatory relations among family, friends, and institutions. And he argues for a new geographical theorization of debt, showing how debt affects urban space, including the movement of bodies through the city, localized economies, and the political violence associated with occupation. Bringing cultural and urban imaginaries into conversation with the sociology of finance, the book shows how debt itself becomes a slow violence embedded into the everyday lives of citizens. However, debt is also a means through which Palestinians practice endurance, creatively adapting to life under occupation. To frame our conversation this evening, I want to draw attention to two themes in the book that are crucial for not just understanding the present we live in, but also to finding escape routes towards a better future. The first is how communities finance what they value, and the second is the importance of paying attention to what communities are already doing to live in the present and capacitate a better future. Now, in every place the IGP works, we begin with the question, what does prosperity mean for the communities living there? What do people and institutions value? What constitutes real quality of life? And underpinning all these questions is the problem of how we create social, political, and financial systems that support what is really valued. Spacing Debt answers this question by pointing to the ways in which ordinary people creatively use what the Palestinian Authority and the nascent Palestinian finance sector offers them, in combination with social obligations and solidarities. Chris is also exploring these questions through his leadership of the IGP's Financing Prosperity Network. Look out for the forthcoming book, Solutions to Debt, co-edited with Dr. Amy Horton from UCL Geography, which draws together progressive responses to financial hardship being advanced and advocated by members of this network. This book will be part of the IGP's new open access book series, Global Prosperity in Thought and Practice, which will be published by UCL Press. And this term, presentations in the IGP Soundbites and Seminar series on inclusive and regenerative economies have also mapped out a series of possibilities for financing more inclusive and sustainable prosperity. To focus on just one example, Sarah Dew recently discussed IGP's collaboration with Camden Council to expand the free services residents have access to and ensure the borough's residents can live secure livelihoods by working in meaningful and better paying jobs. Please do watch all of these events from the IGP, including a presentation by the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, last week, and all are on our YouTube channel. IGP's work on making a living and creating secure livelihoods is not simply enriched by the multiple spaces, including Palestine, where we conduct research. Rather, this difference is necessary if we are to understand the ways in which geographical and historical complexity shape understandings of prosperity. We collaborate with residents across London, where UCL is physically located, but we also learn a great deal from communities where liberal democratic norms are not present. In such contexts, people must endure, as Chris puts it in Spacing Debt, through mobilizing family relationships and whatever financial resources are available. Spacing Debt draws our attention to one of the ways in which long-standing forms of social and political organization are adapting to rapid urban change and population movement. And as he makes clear in the book, the neighborhood where his research takes place is one formed by migrants and refugees whose networks and senses of belonging stretch to other parts of Palestine and beyond. The IGP's work in Lebanon through the Relief Center similarly explores how communities formed through mass displacement create new kinds of infrastructures for living, which include but go beyond the built environment. Developing new systems, innovations, and political communities that can respond to the grand challenges of our time, such as mass displacement, economic inequality, political oppression, and climate emergency, will require concerted effort from governments, businesses, universities, and the third sector. In leading this change, IDP is adamant that we need to pay close attention to the context-specific solutions that communities are already developing. And this is why rich and brilliant ethnographic studies of particular places like Spacing Debt offer us so much. And so we're here tonight to launch this great book and to have a discussion about all of the wonderful things it offers us and the provocations that it offers too. And so I'm going to start now by inviting Dr. Christopher Harker to talk about his book for a few minutes and before we hear from the rest of the panel. So Chris, please.
Thank you, Henrietta, for that very generous introduction. I also want to just start by thanking Vicky, who's arranged everything this evening. And thanks to all of you for joining me and particularly the invited speakers. It's a real honor. After spending roughly 10 years, perhaps even a bit more on this project, it's a joy and a relief to celebrate the publication of this book. And those who have read it will know I truly believe this can only be done with others, and particularly those who've been involved in the process. I'm also acutely aware that many of you are dealing with things like homeschooling children, overwork, Zoom fatigue, general life fatigue. So sincere and genuine thanks for the gift of your time this evening. I really appreciate it. In my short presentation, I want to give an overview of some of the main arguments, and then I'm going to finish with some more gratitude because it's overspilling. So there's now a considerable interest in financial debt, and there has been for some time, as amounts both within and between nations have grown. And academic scholarship, particularly anthropology, has long considered the role of credit debt in shaping lives. Multiple forms of value emerge in practices of borrowing and lending, and work by colleagues like Deborah and Sahini and Ryan and other people who all seem to be at LSE, like Laura Bear, and I see Becky's with us this evening, was a crucial starting point for my own conceptual understanding. And this was a project that didn't actually begin with debt. It began with families and their relationships and how they relate to urban space. So debt, we learn from this work, is a powerful social relationship emerging from and contributing to the inequalities of wealth political voice and agentic capacity, as scholars like Lazzarato, Graeber, and others have shown. Debt relations also have an important temporal dimension, as futures are mortgaged in the present, leading to other presents governed and constrained by past decisions to borrow. See the present financial situation of many UK universities, for an example. The title of my book, Spacing Debt, points to its main contention that we need to understand credit debt as a spatial as much as an in addition to temporal and social relation. Debt is a means of connection and disconnection, binding particular peoples, institutions, and places together while bypassing others. I build on geographical conceptualizations of topology, a relational understanding of space, to explain how debts make families who live thousands of miles apart intimately proximate to one another, and banks become and the ways in which banks become enfolded in the practices and landscapes, emotional, psychological landscapes of everyday family life. And although in the book I don't really focus on the PA's debts, I think the conceptual argument I offer can help us understand how institutions and nation states, I'm not saying the PA is a nation state, are co-constituted within and by webs of credit debt relations. Spaces, both topographic and topological, in turn co-constitute debt relations. And in the book, I use a third term, debt ecology, to capture the resulting formations. So why is a spatial conceptualization of debt important? I think it is important because it invites an extrovert geographical imagination that looks beyond the topographic boundaries of cities, nations, or homes and what is happening within them. This is something I do perhaps most extensively in chapter 4, where I think about Ramallah, the central city in Palestine, as an ecology of obligations, financial and otherwise. In other words, the city is not just seen as a bundle of dynamic relations, but these relations are asymmetric flows in which money, people, ideas move towards Ramallah and constitute the city and exceed other processes of moving away from the city. Ramallah and all that it encompasses is crucial to the conceptual arguments of the book. It provokes new kinds of thinking about credit debt, demonstrating what is possible when we move beyond the elite financial centres, perspectives of power, and Eurocentric basis of most geographies of finance. The book contributes to efforts to rethink Ramallah and its political and economic centrality within the PA's emaciated geography of Palestine. And for those not familiar with the context, Palestinian lands have been colonized and settled since 1948, and there's an argument that obviously settler colonialism began well before that. After a series of diplomatic agreements signed in Oslo in 1993, Ramallah became the de facto capital of the occupied Palestinian territories. The Ramallah conurbation, for people who don't know, is ostensibly actually very small. Its population was estimated at around 200,000 people by municipal employees when I was doing the field research. It became the de facto political capital of Palestinian life due to the location of nearly all Palestinian Authority ministries there as they waited and continue to wait to move to Jerusalem. Consequently, economic capital has also been concentrated there, given the large number of people in the West Bank who rely on PA jobs and the forms of consumption this enables. Ramallah is often described as a bubble, an economic, political, and cultural space disconnected from its surroundings. Kareem, amongst others, has unpacked this idea in great depth in an article in Jadaliyah, and just as he suggests in that piece, the book also tries to explore the ways in which the lives of those living in this purported bubble stretch well beyond its supposed boundaries, and here I'm thinking of topographic boundaries in many ways. My interlocutors in this studies are almost all migrants and refugees who have a range of perspectives on lending and borrowing and the city they reside in. The diversity and complexity of these lives that are so often occluded from accounts that either buy into the boomtown rhetoric or seek to discredit it are also, I hope, an important contribution. And I particularly want to note the importance of work by Rema and also Lisa Taraki, which has been invaluable in trying to write about debt and everyday life amidst colonial violence. In the book, I use 3 specific foci to advance the more general argument. The first is that to fully understand debt and its spatialities in Ramallah, it's necessary to frame credit-debt relations as one obligation amongst many. Participants moved through and negotiated these entanglements in different ways, pointing to the need for accounts of life with debt or debts that are not reducible to simply an indebted life. So characterizing life as just about living with debt. These many relations also highlight more than individual modes of being, which I refer to as obligatory subjectivity. This concept seeks to capture the important work that families do as a collective subject of debt, whilst also being alive to the differences in the power dynamics within families in how they live with and manage indebtedness. The second foci is slow violence, and here I use the work or the scholarship of Rob Nixon and Laurent Ballant to explore how the Ramallah debt ecology wears people out. In Ramallah, work is essentially the key form of collateral for many financial forms of debt, and particularly bank debt. Thus, work, both low-paid employment and unpaid social reproductive work, can become a form of slow violence that exhausts and undoes obligatory subjectivity. And I hope this offers a complementary account of violence to those that we often read about in a Palestinian context, which is referring to the military and bureaucratic violence of the Israeli occupation. Work in this context can also capacitate subjects, though, by enabling the realization of their aspirations, particularly around home ownership and maintaining networks of belonging. As a scholar, I've spent most of my career in geography departments where geopolitical accounts have long rendered Palestinian life a derivative of Israel's occupation. And in my published work, I've sort of said a lot about this, usually sort of taking aim at Eyal Weizman's account as kind of emblematic of this way of writing. The challenge in pursuing a different kind of scholarship, which is what I'm more interested in this book, that pays attention to the nuances, differences, and agentic capacities of Palestinian lives, is that the Israeli occupation clearly is hugely impactful and destructive. And amidst such destructive violence, there are few scenes of heroic resistance, to sort of paraphrase Elizabeth Povinelli's work. However, there are all kinds of situated practices of capacitation, or what I term endurance, which is the third foci. Financial debts and social obligations are ways in which people get by, get on, and sometimes get out. But as I'm at pains to stress, this is deeply ambivalent terrain. Ultimately, problems of debt will not be solved with more debt and more finance. And I think this is where spacing debt ends and my current research on financial inclusion begins. So to briefly conclude this talk, I want to thank some of those to whom I feel I'm most obligated. So firstly, thank you sincerely to Deborah, Rema, and Kareem, not only for participating in this event, but for all your help and guidance in understanding how debt, obligation, and aspiration are enfolded in the urban, political, and economic and social change happening in Ramallah. The first people I thank in the acknowledgement sections of the book itself are Doreen Sayad and Rema Shabeta. Doreen and Rema were amazing research assistants who helped me interpret what we were hearing and seeing in the neighborhood where the research was done and put it in context. And they've really shaped this work in important ways. I also very much want to mention Lisa Taraki, who's a wonderful mentor, and I'm thrilled that she's with us this evening. Thanks to all of my readers, and particularly Vanessa and Amy and Hannah, and Sahini, and for sort of guiding me out of the many mental cul-de-sacs that I ended up in during the writing process. I also want to say that Duke University Press have been absolutely fantastic publishers who I recommend unconditionally. If you're an academic, they've simply been wonderful. And finally, thanks to all of you who've supported me in life as colleagues, friends, families, students during this process. There were some really tough periods, and it's actually not hyperbole to say that this book would never have reached the publication or would never have been published were it not for many quiet, everyday acts of kindness and generosity. So thanks to you too. And I'll hand the floor over to Henrietta.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think that's given us a great flavor of what the book's about and your experience of working in the field and the approach that you take. And so now I would first like to invite Professor Rema Hammami. Rema, to take the floor and to give your thoughts on the book, please.
First of all, I'd like to really thank Chris for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And it's so wonderful to have finally seen this work come to light. And yeah, so in many ways, I see it as a continuation of Chris's earlier work on family and space, the everyday, and his sort of enduring focus on the non-spectacular, non-big crisis event in Palestine, but on the everyday living in and with colonial violence. But here he brings those earlier insights and interests into dialogue with a new lived and conceptual world of questions around space, spatialities, and debt in Palestine, as seen through the lives of in-between Palestinians in a particular quarter in Ramallah, that, as he shows very much, is itself very indebted to the rise of debt infrastructures in Palestine. I want to highlight a few of what I think are very important contributions of Chris's book in the context of Palestine and Palestine studies. There was an elephant in the room when he was writing this book, and I can see it sitting there in the corner of the pages, which is that, let me turn it back. He provides much that complicates a very sort of dominant rhetorical frame and tropes about neoliberal Palestine, a kind of reductive representation of the rise of neoliberal subjectivities under a neoliberal path taken by the Palestinian Authority in post the Second Intifada. It's a kind of narrative and representation that's common in everyday talk, but is also constantly produced by academics. And it's a kind of reading which tends to be very, besides reductive, sort of very moralistic. And I think in some ways, understandably expresses a sense of loss and mourning for a more radical Palestinian past and way of being as compared to the present. So that elephant in the room was an elephant in Chris's book that he was taking on, but he didn't call it out directly. And I think what's really interesting is also you see that that kind of narrative, neoliberal Palestine, blah, 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 is often voiced in various ways by your research subjects who are pulled into these debt formations themselves. Instead, what Chris offers is a reading of how, when these very problematic global financial instruments are taken up in Palestine, they are reshaped by Palestinian life worlds and everyday practices. They don't operate as some fixed apparatus that then goes forth and produces homogenized, neoliberalized worlds, subjectivities, and forms of subjectification. Instead, they enter into a complex Palestinian spatial and social world and are interpolated in complicated ways into dense networks of family, kin, and other networks of mutuality and obligation. And through that process, debt itself is both transformative, but also transformed. And this can only come from doing what Chris did, which is closely listening to and attending to everyday people's narratives of their everyday experiences of debt, with debt and of debt. In capturing that, Chris also captures something many sympathetic writers on Palestine tend to miss, and actually which Chris mentioned in his introduction, which is a much more complicated understanding of the variety of Palestinian subjectivities, of the messiness of Palestinian life, of what, the messiness involved in surviving what Povinelli calls something like crud, right? The cruddiness. In the book, there's no singular heroic, good, bad Palestinian. There's no singular Palestinian subject or subjectivity. Instead, what we have are really full humans. Thank you, Chris. Full of contradictions and ambivalences, varied and varying in their subjectivities, and also how they read the range of social phenomena around them. There's a very nice part, I think, where this becomes really, really clear, is in your really close reading of the narratives around the meanings of being free in Ramallah. Yeah, it was finally for me, I think what struck me so strongly from your book is how bank debt or financialization, rather than destroying the critical role of kinship and family networks in supporting the social, material, and economic life trajectories of their members, bank debt instead has recomposed and reconfigured many of their meanings and modes of operation, okay? This is partly because debt came in, as Chris shows, exactly when the political economy that enabled certain previous forms of kin obligation and entitlements near but evaporated under radical restructuring by Israeli settler colonialism and the Oslo Accords that became most apparent after the Second Intifada. In that past, familial and kin obligations included things like ensuring housing for a son, paying for a son's wedding. And there was sort of the well-known practice of, I think it was called the stepping stone strategy of households towards educating, getting university education for sons. The first son is borrowed and paid for and sent off to university. And once he finishes, then he's obliged to pay for his brother, who then once he finishes pays for the next and for the next and for the next. So those kinds of forms of what Chris uses the language of mutuality for, and forms of familial support have really, they haven't disappeared. What you have is all of these expectations of horizontal and intergenerational transfers within families is now very often mediated by the logics of bank debt. And in the process, this both mediates and transforms the nature of those obligations. So the obligations are there, and there are all of the processes of trying to meet them, but it's now happening in a new grammar, right? A new grammar that has been given life by bank debt, made possible by bank debt, but also changed the terms and meanings of how those obligations are met. On the critical side, and there was another elephant in the room in the book, which is geopolitics, right? You show very much how bank debt capacitates the endurance of your interlocutors, the average households and their members in Sharia. But you constantly drift past or step around how financialization capacitated the larger geopolitical project of the Palestinian Authority, and all that institution, or whatever you want to call it, that assemblage solidifies as an object, practice, and imaginary of a state in the making towards, very significantly, a two-state solution, right? I mean, the PA represents a massive geopolitical investment in a two-state solution, right? One that's now 25 years old, I think. And it's a subject and agent of those forces. And as it's really clear, Chris, you know, because you put all of the markers there, right? These credit instruments happened in a moment when the whole edifice of Oslo and the creation of the Palestinian Authority had imploded, right? And with that implosion would also sort of the whole two-state thing would go down the drain. It's not Fayyad, it's Fayyadism, okay? This man who just happened to be the right figure for the conjunctural moment of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again by, you know, the two-state technocrats and generals, right? So you don't have to see this as a plot or conspiracy, and you don't have to see the introduction of financialization as some kind of a counterinsurgency move, which I know is what you want to stay away from, that kind of argument. But you can't, you did, but I don't think you should have just ignored these larger geopolitical issues, because also they are part of the topologies you're talking about. And they're very powerful parts of the topologies you're talking about. You know, you might have seen the whole move towards financialization under Fayyad and these new instruments as a performative aspect of, you know, overhauling the whole financial and security system, more transparency. You know, this is all performances of, yes, we're capable of being a state, blah, 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 which, as you know very well, got the literal seal of approval from both the IMF and the World Bank. Yep, they're ready for statehood, right? Take a look at their banking system. You might have also unpicked the economic rationales for keeping how financialization worked to keep Humpty Dumpty afloat. You know, that's a huge story, and you know what I'm talking about. But basically, you know, donor aid within the constraints of Israeli settler colonialism, it's, you know, 25 years of a dog chasing its tail, and the tail gets shorter and shorter all the time, right? In that process, all debt and risk gets centered in the PA, right? The PA is always in debt to the banks, it's always in debt to its employees, it's in debt to donors. It's all centralized in this edifice that, you know, imperial geopolitics wants to keep alive, right? So how might sort of spreading the possibility of debt through the society capacitate the PA in a certain kind of way? Yeah. I'd love you to just talk a little bit about why you didn't go there. Okay. And just two very quick questions. I was wondering, in terms of sort of the disciplinary systems that they were using to recover bank debt, whether these were similar to what you find globally, or whether these were homegrown solutions. I mean, this kind of pushing the responsibilization of debt into kin and family, right? Through, having a guarantor, as opposed to bringing in, police and non-functioning courts in Palestine. Please don't want to get into this kind of stuff, right? Is it the same or is it different from other contexts in the world? And what role did the microcredit industry in Palestine, that has long used, not just in Palestine, but globally, use those kinds of social disciplinary instruments among the poor? Did that play any role in the development of these sort of disciplinary systems for retrieving debt? And just one more other question. How might your book have been different if you had done your fieldwork in another neighborhood, such as Massoun? And you can tell everybody what Massoun represents. Okay, thanks, Chris.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rema, and great comments and provocations. So this is wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And now we turn to Professor Deborah James. So Deborah, could I invite you to take the floor, please?
Thanks very much. And thank you for inviting me too. I was told to make some critical remarks, but I'm finding it quite hard to think of anything critical to say about this book. And that might reflect the fact that I feel like I've been in conversation with Chris over quite a period of time. We've been to various meetings, I've attended some of the things that he's held. So I feel like we've sort of been having this ongoing conversation. And in many ways, so much of what we've done is similar, partly because of the work that I've done in South Africa, where you had a similar kind of system of effectively apartheid, which I think to some degree is true of Israel and Palestine as well. And sort of a population that was for a long time, in a sense, prevented from getting access to credit and therefore experienced credit apartheid, as it's been called in South Africa. And then sort of quite quickly was suddenly allowed into the world of credit, especially bank credit, and all the complexities that involved. So I keep on finding strong similarities as I read through this book. And in a sense, all I can really do is comment on some of those and sort of liken them to the situation that I've looked at. But I've particularly enjoyed Chris's way of clinching certain quite complex manners with a sort of certain short phrase. And the one that I want to focus on mainly here is that of obligatory subjectivity, which is something that he elaborates on in quite a lot of detail in chapter 5. This is very similar to the kind of stuff I've talked about in my work as well. You get this interesting complexity in the case of debt. You get what anthropologist Stephen Guterman would call mutuality, that is to say, a sense of obligation towards your various family members and things that are not really done through contract. And then on the other hand, you get this market commodified financial debt, what Stephen Guterman would call contract or trade. And when mutuality, on the one hand, comes into sort of conflict or juxtaposition with trade, all kinds of strange results occur. And I think that's at the heart of this obligatory subjectivity that Chris is talking about. So again, just to get back to the point about neoliberalism, which of course you just cannot avoid, what Chris points out is that in contrast to what has been asserted by authors like Laterato, who's very famous for his work on debt, it's not just a matter of financialization, turning people into these kind of sort of almost individuated subjectivities, which have a sort of almost semi-machine-like character to them, and have been sort of interpolated through their debts. Instead, as Chris points out, this is far too generalized. There's actually a relational, interpersonal character to how people behave, especially perhaps in the face of debt. And this is where the family comes in, as Rema was just pointing out. And so a few little examples that I found very striking here was the way in which these families sort of either try to separate very clearly between their obligations to each other and the bank debt on the one hand, so trying to draw this very clear line. So in the old days, you would have gone to your family, you'd have borrowed from them, but now, no, we don't have to do that anymore. We're going to go to the bank. So there's a kind of search for self-sufficiency and away from dependency and reliance on others, which does sound a bit like the Lazzarato, you're becoming a sort of individuated creature. But on the other hand, despite the attempt to draw those clear distinctions, what you find is that certain kind of defaults occur, and suddenly, in one example that Chris gives, you get senior men in this very well-connected neighborhood suddenly start talking to each other and, oh, actually, did you know that your son has defaulted on this debt? So all of a sudden, the collectivity kicks in, despite the fact that you're trying to go to the bank and keep yourself apart from all these sort of, intersubjective mutuality-based relationships. In an interesting way as well, I found that there was another example similarly where sort of mutuality can somehow come up against these more commodified relationships. In one case, a woman's brother in Jordan was sending her money regularly to help pay off the loans that her husband had taken out from the bank. So again, there you get sort of this strictly contract-based relationship with the bank, but then on the other hand, you've got this sort of long distance relationship being kind of called into play to somehow help out. And so the book is full of these interesting perspectives. And one of the interesting parts to me was about the sort of gendered nature of this debt, because as Chris points out, women don't ever become indebted. Generally, this is because of this very patriarchal type of society where even if a woman has a job, she in fact still will, in the case he describes, leave it to her husband to take out the loans and make a decision about whether to borrow, to buy a car, whatever it might be. So what the women do there is rather they manage debt. In other words, once the salary has come in and vast amounts have been paid out straight away to kind of cover the car loan, the building loan, etc., it's up to the women to then make do with the very, very small amount of money that's left over once all of these debts have been paid. So there's a very gendered, interesting account of how these things play out as well. And so as I say, this to me really reminds me of some of the kind of interesting ways in which mutuality and contract both interact and sometimes conflict with each other in the case of South Africa. And so to just sum up then, I think the debt conundrum really juxtaposes apparently unlike sets of values. You get cherished and non-commodified family relations on the one hand that both induce and are subject to the inexorable force of commodified payment plus interest on the other. But we need to be, because of this, beware of simply assuming that debt turns human relations, morality, social obligations into something impersonal and highly individuated, which is exactly what Chris has done here. We've got to recognize that financialization actually exists only because of other interdependencies like those within the household that make it, in fact, possible. And this is the interesting way that these two things come together. And then just to finally end up with a sort of moment, a quote from another friend of ours, Sam Coburn, who doesn't seem to be here tonight, but he's also been involved with ongoing discussions between Chris, I, and others, Ryan as well, and Sohini. Sam points out that we need to be attentive to the ways that debt is generative of life, to the fact that it enlivens futures just as much as it ensnares, and that it is a site through which we manage and interpret relationships, imagine possible futures, and form a sense of ourselves. And in fact, that I think is really what this book has done so very, very well. So sorry for not being critical. All I can really do is say how much I enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Well, that's very good and very interesting stuff on gender there, which I'm sure we'll come back to in the questions. And so now we have a contribution from Professor Kareem Rabie, but I think what we're going to have first is a film, a little video. Yes, good. Someone's got the video under control. So let's listen to the video first.
First of all, thanks to Chris for inviting me, to Vicky for organizing everything, and to Professors Moore, Hammami, and James for their comments. So let me explain why you're seeing a recording of me. New York City has recently expanded its criteria for vaccination, and I am very lucky to have an appointment for my second shot on Tuesday. I'm recording this on Sunday morning to ensure I can participate, even if I'm scatterbrained and feverish by the time Wednesday comes around. So I'm going to say a little bit about what I find unique and valuable about the book, and then try to spin out some of the consequences of the analysis and the questions and productive tensions that it raised for me. In his new book, Spacing Debt, Professor Christopher Harker proposes to use debt to do several new things for the study of Palestine and the study of debt more generally. For Chris, debt is a spatial relation. In his reading, much academic work on debt emphasized it as a temporal relation, a promise to pay back some kind of obligation in the future. Chris proposes to expand and in some ways correct such accounts by emphasizing space and socio-spatial relations. He weaves his material through the work of David Graeber and other anthropologists, and it's somewhat of a provocation towards prominent strands in human geography. He sees spatial production and debt not quite through political economy or fixed capital in the built environment, but through migration patterns, family dynamics, and social questions. I'll return to this shortly because I work on sort of adjacent topics, and I think there are generative differences between our approaches. Through his hierarchy of emphasis, Chris goes in an alternate direction in urban studies. The city itself is an assemblage of different types of social ties at multiple scales. Debt, he argues, is spatial and mutual in ways that other accounts cannot capture. In particular, he describes Ramallah as itself made up of debt obligations. It is what he calls an asymmetrically obligated city. Now, in this part of the analysis, Chris engages with and contributes to literature and ongoing conversations on the specificity of Ramallah by viewing its growth iteratively through debt. Debt makes space, and space makes debt. Debt is an active co-constituent in spatial relations, and Ramallah itself both obligation and obligated. And there's a long history to this kind of debt. Chris joined scholars like Munir Fakhreddin recently, Salim Tamati long ago, and thinking about how much of what constitutes both the Palestinian experience and forms of Palestinian nationhood might have a debt or perhaps political economic character. Debt is central to matters of land ownership and agricultural labor, urban consolidation and occupation, and the geographies of Palestinian capital and class stratification. Now, one thing these authors point out is that through Zionist colonization and later through the Nakba, ownership came to have a political character. Swinging that history back around to the present, pre-existing debt relations are changed by and through shifts in land consolidation, personal fixity and mobility, but also labor markets, jobs, and the spatialization of class. And this is one of the primary contributions of this book, to my mind. It demonstrates how debt is altering and producing Palestinians' relationships to place, movement, family. So for Chris, the current situation comes out of a long history of de-development, Israeli spatial consolidation, and so on. And although one might be forgiven if they assume that the solution to de-development is development, Chris gives us a framework, the assemblage, the cat's cradle, that calls such linear thinking into question. He is, in my view correctly, pointing out that many of the present political, economic, and social outcomes emerge from the logic of occupation, but are both unintended and productive. Most notably for Chris, this is happening at a time when debt is ever more central to crafting life and possibility in Palestine as a means of endurance there, through increasing availability of credit for consumer spending as part of a wider lure of feeling around aspiration, while also in a context of slow, ongoing, everyday crisis. Now I want to talk through a handful of the questions your book generated for me, Chris, with emphasis on some of the theoretical and methodological arguments you make. First, straightforward, I want to hear more about the credit information system. In what ways does this differ from systems in other countries? If it does differ, what do you think are the possibilities for it existing in personal, family, and social life in Palestine? And if it doesn't, what does it mean for the future or for the financial systems being built up there? Next, you heavily emphasize how your work comes from below, and you strive to craft theory in conversation with Ramallah's residents. Now, I quite appreciate how you emphasize the work your research assistants did and how you conceive of it as a collaboration and co-production of knowledge. You also, of course, spend a lot of time with non-Palestinians. Lazzarato stalks throughout the text, and you find explanatory tools in Whiteman, Pavanelli, Berlant, and others. So as you were researching and writing, how did your interlocutors or Palestinian knowledge more broadly influence your approach to or help you rethink Whiteman, Pavanelli, Berlant? Now, us Palestinians, as many people here I'm sure know, constantly talk about politics. So to what extent do you view your interlocutors as speaking not only to experience or feelings about debt, but as providing political, geographical, and political economic analysis? As a methodological and theoretical process, how did you conceive of your role in putting their theorizations in conversation with your own, as well as the theorists you draw on? Third, your critical stance towards more general scale accounts. Do you think it's possible to bring structural analysis in without being deterministic? The reason I ask is because personally, I do think that a lot of what you're talking about is shaped and mutually produced in relation to phenomena at more general scales, which, as you clearly show in other ways, can have bearing on everyday life. So, for example, why did the PA bring capital back in? Why were there bank runs in 36? Relatedly, on page 34, you emphasize fairly recent socio-political dynamics around donor aid that subsumed social and political activism in the occupied territories to the political economic imperatives of global development and capitalism. Now, do you see links between that and the older cases of debt and credit and bank runs, agricultural and industrial change, and so on? Now, this is one angle that your book very productively engages, I think. How might we think about the cost of living right alongside political and spatial consolidation in a wider situation you often describe as settler colonial? So here's my one critique that I think is interesting to think through. Aside from my personal inclinations, one reason I wish you were more forgiving of structural accounts is that I think your study of the sociality and geography of debt can be portable and comparative and doesn't require occupation or a specific type of settler colonialism for it to come into relief. So you're explicitly concerned by the settler colonial mode in Palestine studies, but I think the piece you cite in support of that, Bus Bridges, mischaracterizes Wolf and his project, but more importantly, doesn't do enough to engage with the contours of Palestinian thinking with and debate on the topic. So I've been involved in that conversation in bits and pieces, but I honestly have no dog in the fight. What I think is still very important about it is that Palestinian and indigenous engagement, even highly critical accounts like the Bettacats, for example, are using it precisely to raise questions about messily cohesive frameworks and quite explicitly to say that it is a structure and not an event, which is language that you engage later in the text. So my question here is whether you want to describe it as settler colonial or not, in what ways do you see the context beyond a container for slow violence or as a valuable description, but also a geographical and political dynamic plastic framework? So I have thought about it a lot in terms of various kinds of imperatives, sets of imperatives, spatial, social, racial, political, economic, geographical, so on. So now, one thing I was thinking about in terms of your analysis of social consequences across scales is the discussion of Ramallah as a business city. Now, how does that usage change beyond your neighborhood, or its, as you put it, non-elite Palestinians? How does business itself toggle between scales? And to what extent are the cultural promises around debt as familial aspiration also about, as Neil Smith put it, the freedom embedded in the empire of capital? Now, believe me, I'm not trying to retrofit your approach, but I bring it up here because I do think that your case has the potential to speak to two of those key words, freedom and empire, and how they're overlapping and intertwined historically and through lived experience. So, for example, one of the reasons the PA brought capital back to Palestine was to protect it from legal liability abroad. Another is because the PA and privateers wanted to create a lending sector as part of the state economy building project. These are manifest in daily life, as you rightly point out, in the built environment, schooling, spending, movement, wages being garnished, but also through wider frameworks for pension, social security, social programs, and so on. Consumer debt is one part of multiple, let's say, spatialized forms of debt. Now, perhaps a different place where your account could push our thinking a little further, I want to hear more about the distinctions between land, household, and mortgage debt. How are mortgage loans different from subsistence or purchasing loans? How is class implicated here in terms of access to debt, mobility, and so on? Does the place you buy a used Skoda for your commute confer different obligations and meanings than the Range Rover dealership? But more importantly, on what grounds might they unequally distribute instability? I think your case does a very good job of pointing us in that direction. For household lending, some families simply cannot afford to lend to their relatives. So it becomes another place where people are forced into new kinds of bank debt, into financial arrangements that might be about subsistence over aspiration. This is where your point about bank debts becoming refamiliarized is important, and also key to understanding the co-constitution of debt, crisis, and ordinariness. Now here's my final angle into the question. Tell us more about topology versus topography. I come to the letter through Cindy Katz, and she's trying to do something similar, I think, to link lived experience with common and cross-cutting productive phenomena. So how do you think your cat's cradle expands or supplants this? I think this is one of your main contributions and something I want to hear more about. How do angles and knots do more for us than lines or contours? So I want to just thank everybody again for their discussion and for this opportunity to talk and to celebrate Chris's new book, which is, I'm sure, bound to be an important contribution to Palestine studies and beyond. Thanks again.
Great, and thank you for that. And Professor Kareem Rabie is with us, so he can take part in the conversation. But as he said, he sent the video just in case he was feeling a little feverish. So it was a great video, and we were very pleased to have it. So now, Chris, I know that you would like to respond to a few points there, and perhaps you could pick and choose so that we have time for a few comments from the floor, because there was a lot there in what your interlocutors had to say.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you ever so much for those very rich responses and thoughts, and particularly, I wish, you know, Deborah, I should have just had that sentence as the book, and then I wouldn't have had to write the book with that, to be able to kind of summarize an argument so succinctly, but also, I think, right on the money. I think this is a book about how debt is generative of lives and the differences that is implied in lives. Okay, so I will try to offer very short answers so that there is some time for other voices too. I think the critique that both Rema and Kareem raise is about not really fleshing out the PA and its role in creating the debt economy, and how that actually misses a kind of important shift in geopolitics as kind of Oslo fails, particularly as a project that people invest in kind of emotionally and psychologically. I think that's spot on. Hold my hand up. I think in part there's some sort of maybe ethnographic blindness of a study so focused on one space or neighborhood. I think there's also a case in which trying to kind of stay away from those geopolitical narratives perhaps over-egged the pudding a little bit. And I think thirdly, there's perhaps the kind of route of approach, which was the project began, as I said, as a kind of urban studies project. I didn't kind of learn enough quickly enough. The research that I mentioned on financial inclusion seeks to kind of write that a little bit by working quite directly with the monetary authority and thinking about structures of governance. And the second response is obviously, please read Kareem's book, which does a very good job of kind of telling that story, and is a wonderful kind of complement to my own study, I think, in many sorts of ways. Both Rema and Kareem also asked about sort of tech solutions and the kind of global, local, and Kareem specifically mentioned the credit bureau. And this was something that was built in a bespoke manner by a foreign consultancy. But it's quite bespoke in the sense that it relies on the Israeli ID system to ID, you know, everyone in the territories. There's kind of a longer answer there that's about like the local and global that I probably am going to dodge a little bit. Apologies. I think too the microcredit point is a good one that I'd need to look a little more into, and I think it relates actually to what Kareem was saying about the history of banking and kind of conventional banking, but also agricultural banking. And I understood that to mean in the kind of 1920s and 30s, Kareem, correct me if I'm wrong, but there wasn't a lot of living memory in the institutional actors that I did speak to about those kinds of histories. And similarly, in the actors that were in the banking sector, they didn't mention the microcredit sector. So it's actually an open question. I don't know the answer. It'd be interesting to explore a bit more. It didn't come up, but that obviously might also have been because I wasn't looking into that in close enough depth. And if the research at Mission, for those who don't know, is a very affluent neighborhood right next to Musharait, and it would have been a very different project. And part of this project was to kind of think with this group that it is written out of a lot of the literature around Ramallah for one reason or another. So it was a kind of attempt to think with a population that haven't been linked with. Just in regards to a couple of things Deborah said, I think one thing, I agree, Deborah, it's been wonderful to have this sort of ongoing conversation. And I think one thing I took particularly from Money from Nothing that I would critique my own work for, and I'd hope to sort of flesh out more, that you show in your book is the role of religion, religious morality and sentiments and attachments, and how that feeds into aspirations and the political economy that emerges in South Africa during the period you describe. So that was something I really kind of took out of the comparison of the two works. And also something that I don't really address in enough depth is the role of age. So not just gender, but age and parents and child and children. And Palestine is generally a kind of very bottom heavy pyramid. So there's a lot of young people. And I think that needs more thought and more research. I'm looking at the clock, it's 6:10. So Kareem, sorry that there's many wonderful, wonderful questions. I'm going to follow up at a later date, but thank you for asking them. And they are questions I would like to discuss.
Wonderful. So let's open up to the floor. And I think we're going to have a mechanism for hand raising, and I just have to try and see hands as they come up. And I think Vicky's going to, although at the moment it looks as though everybody's being a little bit slow. So can you think about your questions? Because I know there are lots of questions. You're just looking. People are always anxious at this time not to be the first to ask a question. So I need, Chris, whilst people are thinking, I mean, I didn't want to ask a question, but I did just want to think about the wider issues about subjectivity. So in any theory of subjectivity itself, one of course is born indebted. That's the problem with subjectivity. So that everything you do after that is a kind of management of indebtedness. Yeah. And I guess that really is the one of the fundamental things about the relationship between subjectivity and agency. And in situations where you have structures of indebtedness that grow up around forms of political economy or around financialization of political forms of various sorts, you get actually, as all of these theorists say, a direct interaction between subjectivity and debt, which is just really interesting. Now, okay, hands, everyone, don't be shy. I just have to, people are being very, very.
I think if you're not sure, if under the reactions, I think if you can see a reactions thing, there's a raise hand tab.
Yeah, there's a raise hand. You don't know how to raise hand. Ah, okay, there's Vanessa. Vanessa, please ask a question. There you go.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I really enjoy it and I enjoy very much the responses. But can you give us an example of something in the methodology that you found really difficult?
There were many aspects. Thanks, Vanessa. Particularly for your engagement with the work prior to tonight too. I think I'd say there's at least a couple of things. So, firstly, discussing debt, and particularly if you're approaching it as debt and not money or finance, is something people are very nervous of talking about and often unwilling. It's in the Palestinian context as in the London context, something you can't just have an interview about this topic. And the way we went about solving this challenge was firstly through using Doreen and Rema's networks, so that we had a kind of social basis for the research, if you like, a social basis on which to build the research. And the second thing was that we did repeat interviews, so that we built up to the some of the kind of potentially more intimate details around finance and money. So the project, as I said, started talking about migration, experiences of migration, and then we talked about, oh, how did you kind of support yourself, who paid for what, and this kind of then opened up questions around ownership and work and indebtedness to banks, to other people. So this took place over 6 months with a break for Eid in the middle of it. So I think it required a lot of investment of time, which was part of the kind of challenge, but also it led to the kind of richness of the empirical data that we ended up with.
Great. And so the next question is Charles Croydon. Charles, please.
Yes, I'm concerned about the global debt of $250 trillion, and I wondered what your comment on that was, please.
Global debt is, it's a big question. It's a large amount of debt. I think it's very hard to kind of make a general statement in some ways because of the different ways in which debt functions in different spaces and the different kinds of debt. So a very brief example, in the UK, for those who are based here, they have just heard the media report that our national credit card is maxed out. And this is all we've heard for the last 3 or 4 months. And it shows like a massive misunderstanding of public finances, not to mention ignorance about interest rates, which are almost in negative territory and well could be heading that way. And also issues around ignorance about money creation and how states create money. So in a situation of kind of post-COVID economic renewal, at least in the UK context, we could see public debt as something the state should be taking on to kind of enable new kinds of flourishing and recovery. But in different contexts, and particularly where I'm thinking of the work of someone like Daniela Gabor, who's looking at the role of institutions like the World Bank and how they're preventing many countries in the global south from defaulting on debts that they owe. Clearly, we can see that debt's a very kind of punitive power relationship, and this is hugely kind of damaging. So it's sort of slightly nuanced territory. I think, as I said at the end, generally debt can be a problem, and I don't think debt is the solution to debt problems.
Okay. Now the next question is coming from Ryan Davey, yes, and then after that, Jonah Agus. So Ryan, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chris. It's really great to hear about, hear you speak about what's in the book and hear this discussion. You mentioned a couple of times that flows and obligations are asymmetrical when it comes to debts and other relationships in Ramallah. And I just wondered, like, I'm not asking like a clever question, I'm just asking you to tell me a bit more what's in the book. Like, in what ways are what are the forms of asymmetry? Could you give a few examples of them? It's interesting to hear about that.
Thanks for coming, Ryan. Thanks for the question. That particular part of the book is looking at how do we think about cities, and I tried to kind of use debt almost in a more figurative sense, although arguably in some ways literally, to think about how do we characterize Ramallah through kind of movements of things. Ramallah is a city that grew very rapidly at various stages because people have moved in. That's urbanization in many places, of course. But a lot of the more recent migrants who've come after the Second Intifada, so in the last 20 years or so, are said to be stealing resources from Ramallah. They work there, but they spend their money elsewhere. And so this was an attempt to sort of think about, okay, what is Ramallah's balance sheet exactly like? What's coming in, what's going out? And to what extent is it fair to kind of characterize the city as either kind of a creditor or a debtor? And in some sense, I think this would have been perhaps a good point to then kind of push through to those broader questions of the PA and its role in kind of shaping this economy. And broadly, what I'm trying to point to in the chapter is the kind of power differentials and the fact that Ramallah is essentially sucking in a lot of people and ideas and resources from other parts of the West Bank, and indeed Gaza and Jerusalem and other countries, and not necessarily sharing that wealth or that value with these other places, or certainly not to the same extent. So the asymmetry here is thinking about cities and finance and power.
So the next question is from Chris, is from Jenna Eggers, and he can't ask it himself because he's dealing with a crying baby. But he's saying, could you please say more about how the concept of endurance was used in the work?
Thanks, Jonas. Jonah, thanks for coming. The endurance, I think, is it's a concept that's the solution to a problem that's perhaps the longest running problem that I've had in all my research that Rema alluded to in her discussion, which is how do you describe the agency of occupied indigenous peoples, colonized indigenous peoples, or even marginalized peoples? I think that potentially the concept's got application elsewhere, where forms of violence are really intense and debilitating, but that doesn't mean people are kind of mute and passive. And so I was building on largely Abdul Malik Simone's work from urban studies to think about how do we describe people's capacities and agencies and the way they are able to capacitate themselves in this situation. And in the book, I kind of situate this very briefly in a kind of body of literature that we've seen emerging over the last 10 or so years. So ideas like quiet encroachment and camouflage and some of this kind of social science literature that's thinking about these kind of particular forms of agency that are certainly, far from the liberal heroic subject.
But is that form of endurance? Is it a subject position? I mean, is it a consciously performed activity, or is it a form of activity that is interpreted?
I think, the concept itself, I think, emerges through my interpretation of what are often intentional activities. Yeah.
Okay, great. So now we have a question from Amy Horton. Amy, please.
Thanks to the talk, Chris, and to the panelists for your comments, which I found really insightful. I got booted off briefly, so apologies if you answered this question whilst I was doing my Wi-Fi. I just wanted to ask about the kind of concept of kind of debt ecologies or financial ecologies, and how that articulates with kind of topologies or topographies of debt. So are there kind of scalar differences there? Is there also a kind of ecological implication of debt ecologies that we need to be exploring further as kind of climate change bites? So how do these concepts fit together? And I also really appreciated Kareem's question about your theoretical engagement with your research assistants, Chris, and I wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for pulling out a couple of the points where I should have responded to Kareem and I kind of skipped by. So the first question about ecologies, debt ecologies is a concept I kind of adapt from the financial ecologies concept that Andrew Leishon and colleagues develop and scholars like Karen Lay have used in their work. And the reason I use the term debt ecologies rather than financial ecologies is to point to the way in which debt is part of or folded into all kinds of obligations and relations beyond just what are often thought of as financial. The ecologies is a term conceptually that I use to think about how debt topologies and the topographies that structure them, national borders and law and regulation, are create these kind of moments, assemblages of kind of action and I guess kind of political economic, kind of particular political economic, in this case urban social relationships. So it's trying to name the specificity of a particular debt situation, if you like. I think I don't explore the climate change aspect, but I think that's a really important thing to kind of push further, and it's something I hope to do a bit in future work. The second point was to come back to the question of, you know, what did Palestinian locators, what was their role in conversation with or in relation to kind of theorists, I guess implicitly kind of European theorists, I guess a lot of American, European theorists. So I think in a sense, a lot of the empirical research and particularly the conversations with the kind of 25 families and individuals I worked with pushed me to kind of think about debt beyond simply finance, and beyond the individual. So I think particularly in chapter 5, I have quite an extended conversation with Lazzarato's work, which is useful in all kinds of ways. And I don't want to give the impression I don't learn a lot from that work. But also, I think the kind of empirical research that I did really pushed and opened up the limits of that work and kind of showed where it was kind of lacking. And I think I would say also, I mean, hopefully throughout the book, but particularly also in the final chapter 7 on endurance, and I guess also 6 and 7, where people are talking about work and productivity and the kind of complexity of those discussions. And another point Kareem makes about freedom and empire is kind of well made. I think the kind of empirical push there was really important. And kind of useful for helping me understand and kind of articulate a conceptual literature that it builds on, but goes beyond the existing theoretical frames of the research.
Great, thank you. And I'm a little bit mindful of time, but we have a question from Ala Shahabi, and she's asking, Chris, I'm wondering if you explored in the book what happens relationally and socially when there is debt default or negative equity on the two forms of debt instruments, so mutual bank debt.
So thanks, Ala, for the question. On default, there's I guess two things to say. So in terms of bank debt, we didn't encounter any default, and that's because of the particular way in which debts are tied to salaries. And so, as you know probably, Ala, from the Palestinian context, salaries often don't get paid. But in that case, the monetary authority, which is like the central bank in waiting or central bank equivalent, simply tells banks they can't withdraw or they can't deduct debt payments from salaries if salaries are being partially paid or not paid at all. And the head of credit collection at the Arab Bank told me in an interview that essentially they, particularly with mortgage debt, they would never repossess a house because the optics of a Palestinian bank repossessing a Palestinian home are unthinkable. Like, to the head of credit collection at the Arab Bank, which is the largest bank by capitalization operating, at least at the time of research. On the other hand, like in terms of kind of mutual relationships and those other kinds of debts, there were lots of defaults or stories about defaults. This is where kind of social relationships are, I think it's often like in these kind of scenarios that, I don't want to say drive people towards bank debts, but often people would talk about bank debt in a more positive sense because they would avoid the sort of not just lengthy social negotiations and processes that, as one interlocutor says, involve the whole community. But these kind of processes, yeah, kind of expansive in time and space. So they did happen, and they led to kind of fracturing of social relationships often, and yeah, I think the interesting thing is how the kind of social, even by the same person, can be viewed from kind of both sides as both positive strength and potential problem.
Well, that was a series of wonderful discussions and wonderful questions. And I'm afraid, as usual, we're always out of time too quickly. And I'm sure we could have gone on all evening. What I'd like to do, first of all, is to thank our three wonderful interlocutors, Professor Rema Hammami, Professor Deborah James, and Professor Kareem Rabie. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time and your input into Chris's work and by extension into the work of the IGP. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us for this very, very happy event, which we've been looking forward to enormously. Thank you for being with us today. We hope to see you again at another event. And then finally, of course, to everyone at the IGP who's made this event possible. And of course, to Chris himself. Well done, Chris. Many congratulations. So fantastic.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. See you again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.